December 17th, 1944, 0530 hours, Honsfeld, Belgium. The Tiger tank's engine coughed once, sputtered, and then went dead.
All hatches closed.
In the gray
Stand by
half-light
for
before
contact.
dawn, the sound carried unnaturally far, echoing off frozen trees and empty farmhouses. SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Peiper slammed his fist against the turret hatch in frustration, the metallic clang cutting through the stillness. Below him, his driver tried again to coax life from the massive Maybach engine, 700 horsepower of German engineering reduced to silence. Nothing happened. The fuel gauge needle rested flat against empty. From inside the hull came another voice, tight, controlled, and afraid despite its discipline. The reserve tank is dry too. Peiper climbed down from the turret, his boots crunching into the frozen Belgian soil. Around him sat what was supposed to be the sharpest armored spear the Wehrmacht could still field, the lead element of Kampfgruppe Peiper, the decisive thrust of the Ardennes offensive. 67 tanks, 149 half-tracks, nearly 5,000 Waffen-SS troops. And every one of them was motionless, paralyzed by empty fuel tanks. Through the thin morning mist, Peiper could see the village ahead, Honsfeld. It was an American position, abandoned in haste. Fires still burned in oil drums. Coffee sat cooling in metal cups. And beyond them, arranged in long, orderly rows as if waiting to be claimed, were thousands of olive-drab jerry cans, American fuel containers, a supply depot left behind by the U.S. 99th Infantry Division. Peiper approached slowly, almost reverently. One of his adjutants pried open a can and leaned in, sniffing deeply. High-octane gasoline, real gasoline. As the men began frantically refueling vehicles, pouring American fuel into German tanks and half-tracks, Peiper walked among the stacks, counting, calculating. The numbers were staggering. Roughly 50,000 gallons, enough to fuel his entire Kampfgruppe for the drive to the Meuse River, enough, perhaps, to change the course of the offensive. The Americans had abandoned more fuel in this single forward depot than most German divisions had received in the previous 6 months. Yet the realization settled over Peiper like the fog itself, heavy, inescapable, and suffocating. If the Americans could afford to abandon this much fuel, if they could leave behind what Germany would guard with entire divisions, then the war was already lost. Germany had not merely miscalculated. Germany had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of its enemy. 6 months earlier, in June 1944, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments and War Production, had presented a report that should have ended all German offensive operations immediately. Allied bombing had systematically destroyed Germany's synthetic fuel industry, the bloodline of its mechanized war. Plants that produced 175,000 tons of fuel in April managed barely 5,000 by September. Hydrogenation facilities at Luna, Pulitz, Bleckhammer, and Brooks were operating less than 10% capacity. The numbers told an unavoidable story. In 1944, the United States produced roughly 1.8 billion barrels of crude oil. Germany, including all synthetic fuel and Romanian imports, managed about 33 million barrels, less than 2% of American output. The Third Reich was attempting to wage modern mechanized warfare with logistics that increasingly resembled the age of horses. While America drowned its armies in petroleum, German planners gambled everything on capturing enemy fuel. Major Friedrich Siebel of the Wehrmacht logistics staff calculated that the Ardennes offensive would require approximately 4.5 million gallons just to reach the Meuse River. Hitler allocated 5 million. Barely half of that actually reached the front due to transportation losses and Allied air attacks. The entire operation rested on the assumption that American supply dumps would fall intact into German hands. It was not a sign of strength. It was a confession of desperation. Meanwhile, the Americans had built a logistics system beyond German comprehension. Pipelines ran under the English Channel as part of Operation Pluto. The Red Ball Express, thousands of trucks operating day and night, delivered over 12,000 tons of supplies daily to the front. By December 1944, American forces in Europe were consuming roughly 1.2 million gallons of fuel per day and receiving more than they used. They were building reserves while fighting. Joachim Peiper understood fuel. At 29, he was one of the youngest regimental commanders in the Waffen-SS, a decorated veteran of the Eastern Front. He had learned in Russia that fuel mattered more than ammunition. His Kampfgruppe had been designated the Schwerpunkt, the decisive point of the entire Ardennes offensive. At the final briefing on December 14th, General Sepp Dietrich was blunt. "You will have enough fuel to reach the Meuse if you capture American supplies." Peiper's allocation amounted to about 31,000 gallons, enough for roughly 50 miles of combat movement. The Meuse lay 65 miles away. Failure was embedded in the mathematics from the start. Peiper issued strict orders. Vehicles would move in single file. Engines would shut down during halts longer than 5 minutes. Capturing American fuel was priority one, above all tactical objectives.
The contrast with American operations was stark. That same morning, Captain James Rose of the U.S. 743rd Tank Battalion recorded in his unit diary that they had received 8,000 gallons of fuel, the third delivery that week. Storage tanks were already full. The German artillery barrage that opened the offensive was immense, consuming more ammunition in 2 hours than earlier German operations had been allotted in days. But even this display concealed shortages. Peiper's column moved late, jammed onto narrow forest roads never designed for heavy armor. At Lanzarote, a single American reconnaissance platoon, 18 men, delayed the most powerful armored column in the German army for nearly 10 hours. Engines idled, fuel burned away. By the time Peiper reached Honsfeld on the morning of December 17th, his column had advanced just 20 miles and consumed 40% of its fuel. At that rate, they would not reach even the halfway point to the Meuse. What he found at Honsfeld seemed miraculous, but it was also revealing. The depot was not a major installation, merely a forward supply point, a temporary Class 3 fuel site. Yet it held more gasoline than an entire German Panzer division's monthly allocation. The Americans had not even tried to destroy it. Among the supplies were shipping documents. One German soldier who could read English later recalled seeing the route laid out plainly: Texas to New York, across the Atlantic to Liverpool, over the Channel to Normandy, then by truck hundreds of miles to Belgium. Over 6,000 miles in less than 6 weeks. When Peiper read the papers, he said nothing. His face went pale. They also found American newspapers dated just 2 days earlier, celebrating the opening of a new pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun, capable of delivering hundreds of thousands of gallons per day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Peiper's entire Kampfgruppe would use in the offensive. To understand the shock, one must understand Germany's fuel crisis by late 1944. Allied bombing had reduced synthetic fuel output by 90%. The Luftwaffe grounded aircraft for lack of gasoline. Pilot training hours were slashed. The Navy's surface fleet was immobilized. On the home front, civilians had not seen private automobile traffic in 2 years. Gasoline theft was investigated by the Gestapo down to the liter. Meanwhile, the United States produced roughly 2/3 of the world's oil. One Texas oil field alone outproduced all of German-occupied Europe. American refineries ran so far beyond capacity that new petroleum products were developed simply because excess crude existed. With the fuel from Honsfeld, Peiper surged forward, capturing more supplies. But the maps revealed something deeply unsettling. American fuel dumps were everywhere, at crossroads, villages, and depots large and small. The U.S. First Army alone held millions of gallons in reserve. At Stavolo, Peiper's hopes rose again. Here lay a massive depot, enough fuel to guarantee reaching the Meuse. But American engineers had already arrived. Ordered to deny fuel at all costs, they ignited the entire stockpile. Millions of gallons burned, the fire raging for days, black smoke rising thousands of feet into the sky. Peiper watched in silence. The Americans had destroyed more fuel in a single act than Germany had allocated for the entire offensive. Across the Ardennes, the same scenes played out. Millions of gallons deliberately burned or blown apart. The Americans could afford it. Their supply system replaced losses faster than Germany could count them.
By December 18th, Peiper's force was operating at a deficit. Tigers consumed fuel at staggering rates. Panthers were little better. In the Ardennes terrain, consumption increased by nearly half. The Americans, monitoring German radio traffic, knew exactly what was happening. Orders went out to destroy threatened fuel stocks immediately. While Peiper counted gallons, American aircraft flew fuel into Bastogne by the hundreds of thousands. While German units abandoned tanks for lack of gasoline, American planners approved requests for hundreds of millions of gallons for future operations without debate. By December 20th, Peiper had perhaps 8,000 gallons left, enough to fight or retreat, but not both. His fuel convoy had been destroyed by Allied aircraft. No resupply was coming. "We are fighting an enemy," Peiper told his officers, "who burns more fuel to deny it to us than we received for this entire operation." By December 21st, his Kampfgruppe was surrounded near Le Glaise. American units opposing him had more fuel allocated for a single day than Peiper possessed in total. Tanks were abandoned not from enemy fire, but from empty tanks. On the night of December 23rd, Peiper destroyed his remaining vehicles and led his surviving men out on foot. Of thousands who had begun the offensive, fewer than 1,000 returned. Dozens of perfectly intact tanks were left behind, monuments to a war lost not by courage, but by arithmetic. The lesson spread quickly through German ranks. When Field Marshal Model learned how much fuel the Americans had destroyed rather than surrender, he understood the offensive had failed before it began. Hitler refused to accept the numbers, dismissing them as propaganda, but soldiers knew better. They had seen Americans waste what Germany would die for. They had seen abundance so vast it rendered German scarcity meaningless. That was the true moment the war ended for Germany. Not in Berlin in 1945, but in the frozen forests of Belgium, among empty fuel tanks and burning depots. At Honsfeld, Joachim Peiper did not just find gasoline, he discovered impossibility. Industrial warfare had reached its conclusion. Courage, training, and tactical brilliance could not overcome an enemy whose production turned scarcity into irrelevance. One side measured fuel by the gallon, the other by the million. The Tiger tank that ran dry still sits in a museum today, its fuel gauge empty. Visitors ask why such powerful machines were abandoned. The answer is simple, and it decided the war. There was no fuel.